Okay, today we're going to talk about, or last week we talked about comparing fractions. And today we're going to talk about how this idea of benchmark fractions can help us um, with that, with comparing fractions and getting our mind wrapped around what what is 1/4, what is 3/4, what is going on here. So, what are benchmarks? Benchmark fractions? Well, they're commonly used fractions. And when I was thinking about how to teach all that, I thought about measuring cups. Okay, most people are familiar with these. Okay, you've got usually there's 4. Okay, and there's this is my one hole. Okay, so what we do is we've taken this one hole for baking purposes and measuring purposes, and we've divided it into equal parts. Not just divided it, but divided it equally into this common idea of a benchmark fraction is what we call it. But they're just common ways to divide a whole thing up. The most common way that we think about is half a cup. Okay, there's my half a cup. This is half of the whole. It takes 2 of these to equal one of those. Okay, and then the next one, another common benchmark fraction is 1/3. Okay, so I have one whole, one half, 1/3. Okay, so if I could label that, if you can see it, well, you can see it right there, 1/2 and 1/3. Okay, it takes 3 of these to equal my whole. They've divided this whole equally into 3 of these. So 3 scoops of that into there will fill it up. Okay, the next benchmark fraction is 1/4. Okay, and there's my smaller 1/4 cup. And again, as you see, as the denominator gets larger, what happens to the size of the cup? This denominator, oopsie, if you can see, is 4. Okay, this one's 3, and this one is 2. 2, 3, and 4. The denominators are getting larger, yet the size is getting smaller because we've taken our whole and divided it into more parts. The more we divide it equally, the smaller the parts get. Okay, so here are our benchmark fractions that we're going to talk about today: 1/2, 1/3, and 1/4. Okay, super important. And that idea, it's like a benchmark that you can go to in your mind. It's always there and you see it every time. So our benchmark fractions we've answered that we're going to use are 1/2, 1/3, and 1/4. And again, I've listed them in order from greatest to least. Okay, now we're going to model those and using our common models that we use. In a circle model, there's 1/2. I'm going to use the shaded part for my numerator because that's the typical way you'll see it, not all the time. Circle model for 1/3. And I always think of putting a dot right here and drawing the peace sign. There's 1/3 of that whole. And then here's 1/4 divided in half. Split my halves into fourths, and there is 1/4. Okay, so 1/2, smaller 1/3, even smaller still 1/4. Okay, so now let's look at our bar model. Same thing, I'm going to stack my bars on top of each other. Okay, and compare, use benchmark. We're going to use these later to compare, but let's do 1/2. Okay, there's 1/2 of my whole. I've identified the whole as the bar, and then I kind of just eyeball it to break it into thirds. It's not perfect, but let's pretend that it is. 1/3. And then to get my fourths, I break it in half and then break my halves into 2 equal parts, and there's 1/4. 1/2, 1/3, 1/4. Okay, and then if I want to do this on number line, Here's 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1. There's my 1 whole. Okay. And I'm going to break my 1 whole into half. I'm going to identify, there's 1/2. Now I've got to divide it into thirds. 1, 1, 2, 3 thirds. Here's 1/3. And I've got to divide my whole into, I'm going to use a half again, then make fourths from my halves. And here is 1/4. Again, 1/2, smaller, 1/3, even smaller, 1/4. Okay. So I'm going to stop that recording. Well, not yet. These are our benchmark fractions. So in your mind, whatever whole you're talking about, if it's a model on paper and you have to solve it on a paper I give you or someone gives you, you can do that. You have to be able to see half, a third, a fourth in a circle model, a half, a third, of 1/4 of a bar model, 1/2, 1/3, and smaller 1/4 in a number line, on a number line model. And then in real life, most importantly, think about, okay, here's my 1 whole. In real life, that's a real life situation. Half of that, 1/3 of that, and then 1/4 of that, okay? I'm going to pause the recording and then we'll talk a little more. Okay, I'm going to share the screen again, and we talked about what our benchmark fractions were that we were going to talk about, that we're going to use, and why are they helpful? One, because it makes you math savvy. That means you get it. When someone says 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, you understand what they're talking about. You have it in your mind already. That's why they're important. And then from there, is because they can get you where you need to go. Let's say in life you're comparing something, I don't know, a cooking situation, because we used our measuring cups, okay? And it calls for 2 or a half a cup of something, and you don't have your cups, your smaller cups, you've lost them. I don't know why, but you lost it. You don't have your half cup, but you do have your whole cup, your 1 whole cup, and you know, oh, half, I know that is half of this, and that's great. Or let's say you only had 1/4 of a cup of what you needed, and you know, well, wait a minute, I know that 1/4 is half of a half, right? So I need to double this, and then I'll get my half. There's so many ways to use fractions, okay? So let's say you're working on your paperwork, and we're going to go down to here. How can I use them when I'm solving my problems on paper? And we're comparing 1/3 versus 1/4. Well, how are these benchmark fractions going to help me? Well, if I know 1/3 and I go back to my real life examples of a third, 1/3 versus 1/4, okay, well, you can see that 1/4 is the smaller one, 1/3 is the larger one. But if I take that away, if you can get it, the benchmark in your mind, benchmark it in your mind of a third, you know, a bar model, 1/3 versus same bar model, 1/4. Did I do that? Oh, need to scooch that over. Versus 1. Let me do that one again. I don't want to redo this whole recording, but maybe do a better job of fourths. 1/3 versus 1/4. 1/3 is definitely more than 1/4, and you already need to kind of know that in your mind and work with those benchmarks. Okay, I know what a third is of a whole. I know what 1/4 of a whole is, and I know that 1/3 is a bit more than 1/4. Okay, and then what happens if you have 1/2, one of your benchmark fractions? You should have a half in your mind without a picture, without me pulling the cups up here, or looking at a ruler. Even these are fractions to death, wholes and fractions all over this. Okay, and you're thinking, well, is a half of an inch more than 3/4, or is 3/4 of an inch more than 1/2? Okay, well, let's look at 1 inch right here. Okay. Do you see the half mark? I do. It's right there. Okay. So there's half of an inch. Well, let's compare that to 3/4. Well, I know in my mind, if I use my benchmark, just like you did for half just then, I have it in my mind, wait, the whole thing divided into 4. There it is, 1, 2, 3/4 right there. Oh, 3 small, there's 1, 2, 3/4. That's more than the half mark. So 3/4 is greater than 1/2. 1/2 is less than 3/4, right? But without my visual, without that tape measure, you need to be able to do that because of those benchmark fractions that you have in your mind. You should have already seen, hey, if this is, well, let's do the number line for that. If this is 1 inch, okay, I know where half is, and I know that this is a fourth, but if I have 3 of those fourths, I know that the 3/4 is more than that 1/2 right there, okay? So if you need to go back and rewind that or anything, you can. I'm going to have a couple of questions about benchmark fractions and how to use them in comparing fractions, which we were talking about last week, and we're doing that a little bit more today, okay? And so I'm actually going to pause the video and show you one more thing that I just thought about. Okay, we're back for one more little part. I'm going to share the screen. Another way our benchmark fractions can help us solve problems. And this is a way to think in your mind, okay? Here's my one whole, okay? This is my one whole thing. Let's say it's a candy bar, and I have half of it, okay? How many more halves does it take to get to that whole, okay? See how far that is? If you have half of that one, how much more do you need to have the whole thing, have the whole candy bar? Our next benchmark fraction, 1/3. Look how much you need. If you have 1/3 of your candy bar, 1/3 of it, how much more would you need to have the whole thing? If you have 1/4 of your candy bar, how far away are you from the whole, having the whole thing? Okay. Another thing, instead of a candy bar, let's say you need to run a mile, and you've run half a mile. Okay. How much more do you have to run? Okay. And or you just have run 1/3 of a mile, 1/3 of a mile. How much further do you need to run to make it the whole mile? And if you just run 1/4 of a mile, how much further do you need to run to make it the whole mile? And I could set this up, an example of something like this, how you could use this thought in a problem. Let's say I want you to compare, let's say Susie ran 1/3 of a mile. That's how far Susie ran. I should capitalize that. That's a proper noun. And Megan ran 1/4 of a mile. Okay. Who has to run further? Okay. If Susie's run 1/3 and Megan's run 1/4 of a mile, who has to who has more to run to get to their mile? Okay. Who has to run more? Well, Megan has to run more. She has to run this far to reach the whole mile. And Susie has to run this far to reach the whole mile. Megan has to run more because 1/4 is less than 1/3. Megan's 1/4 isn't as far as Susie's 1/3, right? So Megan has to run further than Susie has to run, okay? Keep these benchmarks in your mind. That's why I'm using a whole lesson on this, is to just imprint that idea of 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, and they're very, very useful in your real life in all kinds of ways, okay? There'll be some questions on Google Forms, okay? Probably not, maybe 10. All right. Thank you, and I will see you later.